Thank you very much, everyone, for coming this evening. It's always great doing trying to prepare a meeting on revolutionary history, and you think, oh, well, I'll go back and I'll look at the 1920s and 1940s, 1950s, and maybe even the 1860s. But every moment your eyes are turning constantly towards what's happening at the moment. So if you forgive me, I'll do a sketchy bit at the beginning about the history of the Arab working class, as sketchy as it can be, and we'll try and concentrate a bit more on events as they are now, not events as they're unrolling, but what I think are the important forces in the real question, some deep questions that are rising over the role of the working class inside the revolutions, and how the changing nature of the working class inside the Middle East actually means that this wave of revolutions, I think, is going to open up much bigger possibilities than we'd had before. And just kind of very, very, very briefly, with the first appearance, if you like, of capitalism in the Arab world, we had the development of the first kind of quite small sections of the working class. In Lebanon in the 1840s, 1850s, there was the introduction of spinning mills, silk production, and so on, which began to transform the country. You had these factories that were essentially dropped into village areas that drew in more and more sections of the peasantry that began to create real capital that was feeding at that time French capitalism. From these very beginnings also, we saw the first struggles. So the women spinners in Mount Lebanon in the 1840s through the 1860s began to develop a sense of class identification, began to take on their bosses, began to alter and change social relations as well as their struggles began to develop. And Lebanon really was, I think, probably one of the first places in the Middle East where this process of capitalism was really to kick off. But as with the appearance of imperialism, with the colonialism, and the rise in importance of the Middle East, then we began to see more and more of kind of capitalist penetration, development of capitalism inside the region, with the development of cotton as a product in Egypt, the beginnings of the spinning mills, of course the discovery of oil, the digging of the Suez Canal, all these things that began to bring in with them deep social changes inside the region. And this history, if you like, of the Arab working class is one that I think points to what's happening in the direction of things are happening at the moment. We have to remember that during this period, all the way through to the 1940s, 1950s, the working class was still quite a small section of the mass of the Arab population. And at that time, the main struggle, what seemed to be the main struggle, was a struggle to get rid of the colonial powers. And the working class in Egypt and Iraq and all these places began to take and use, if you like, develop their own struggles as part of this anti-colonial struggle, leading to quite huge explosions. The most important, I think, the one that marked a new era was the 1919 uprising, or 1919 revolution inside of Egypt, which then spun off from this revolution, a whole wave of militancy that was to really kind of mark the beginning of the 20th century. And we can look at the high points of this in the 1940s, early 1950s, with Hala Kubra, the big strikes, the way these strikes linked in with the anti-imperialist struggle, but also the way this whole period, if you like, was to a certain extent betrayed. That is, that for objective and subjective reasons, the working class was unable in this time to really push through to what we call permanent revolution. That is, to take the revolution much further than was possible. So we had, starting in Egypt, back in Iraq, and other countries as well, we had what we call deflected permanent revolution. The working class unable to break through, carry through the revolution anymore, opened up the space for a section of the middle class, in the case of Egypt and Iraq, round young officers, just to step in and take power. And in so doing, they brought through a whole series of important social changes, but also blocked the development any further of the working class, suppressing strikes, and taking the basic class organizations, the trade unions, and incorporating them into the state. And you see this process repeated time and time again throughout the Middle East. And I've just been reading the history of Libya, where you see this really concentrated, where in 1967 there were huge strikes, there was almost mass uprisings and riots in Benghazi and Tripoli. Muammar Gaddafi stepped in, very similar, out of the officer corps, makes the coup. 2 or 3 years later, he not only outlaws strikes, but makes it punishable by death. And you see actually how these tremendous movements, the anti-colonial struggles, the anti-imperialist struggles, but also the working class element of it, hit, if you like, this point this point where it could not go any further, where it was blocked either for one reason or another, unable to fulfill, we say, its historic task, that is to take the revolution forward. We have to, I think, trying to place a date on when we can mark the end of what we can call this revolutionary period, whether it was the 1970s, the early 1970s, or the mid-1970s, where really we begin to see these things go into massive reverse. I always think of it as coming to that whole revolutionary period coming to a halt in 1982 in the massacre of Sabra Shatila, if you like. It marked the very darkest point in Arab history, and also the point at which I think all the whole kind of nature of the regimes that emerged out that first period began to settle in and become a new ruling class. The thing about this whole period was, I think, it was marked by 3 distinct things, the 3 pillars, if you like, of the regimes. The first one was the rhetoric of anti-imperialism, and you can see it in Libya, but you can also see it in the other Arab countries, where there was a constant rhetoric against imperialism, support for the Palestinians, to a certain extent even arming certain Palestinian groups and so on, but actually at the same time suppressing in a real way the Palestinian struggle, but continuing with the rhetoric of it. This rhetoric, and part of it, had to do with a kind of an agreement or an understanding with imperialism that they would at some point, in reply for silencing the Arab street, at some point or other there would be some kind of 2-state solution, which the Saudis spearheaded and tried to push through in 2002, and that this 2-state solution was rejected. So if you like, that anti-imperialist rhetoric that kept that kept the hope alive, if you like, that something can change, completely and utterly disappeared. It disappeared primarily because the Israelis and the Americans were unwilling to deliver. So if you like, that, I think, collapsed completely in 2002. The second important component, the second pillar, I think, of these regimes was the social stability, or the social contract in which they put through. In Egypt, mass nationalization, to a certain extent people getting pensions, subsidies on bread, all these kind of things that actually kept the poor or the lower classes from starving, and kept them to a certain extent just hovering above the poverty line. That social, that whole period then began to be torn apart with the introduction of neoliberalism, mass privatizations, and again, go over the rhetoric, go look through the rhetoric, and you find this taking place in every single one of the Arab regimes. What's really interesting, again, with Libya, was Muammar Gaddafi describing the privatization process that he introduced inside of Libya as the extension of popular control. So again, you can, no need to stumble over the rhetoric, just look actually at the reality. This, if you like, began to rip apart that pillar which tied, to a certain extent, the interests of the poor people with the stability of the regime itself. And so the third pillar, the last pillar, left with the other 2 gone, was simply the apparatus of repression. That is, the only thing almost that they could rely on with the ideological collapse, the social collapse that was taking place and so on, the thing was the heavy repression. And so the whole, almost every country in the Middle East had extremely harsh conditions. There was always that thing that said that, what was the joke? It's a Syrian joke, actually, which says in Egypt, for every 15 civilians, there's 1 secret policeman. In Syria, for every 4 civilians, there's 1 civilian. The rest are secret policemen. The kind of joke. But just to give you an idea of actually how harsh it is, and we can see when the first stirrings, especially in Syria, of the Arab Spring, amongst children, 13, 14-year-olds writing graffiti on the wall. What was the response of the regime? Was absolutely brutal, complete and utter brutality. That aspect of the repression became very, very important. So there was, I think, other changes and very fundamental changes that also took place in this period, which is the whole nature, if you like, the social nature of the Arab world changed significantly. One was the process of urbanization that was taking place. That really, in the last 20 or 30 years, has really accelerated. And I have a few facts here I think that will illustrate it. For example, in 1965, Oman, 22% of the population were urban. The rest lived in the countryside. Now it's 72% of the population are now urban. The same in Syria. What was 40% of the population lived in cities in 1965. Now it's over 50, nearly 60%. The rest who live in the countryside live and work in very capitalist farms, mass plantations, and so on. And in Saudi Arabia, another huge marked shift from 1965 to now, where there was 39% of the population who were urban, and now it's 82%. Again, in Lebanon, where it was, I think it was around 50%, just over 50%, or just under 50% of the population were in the countryside, 1965. Now it's 92, 93, 94%. Actually, there's huge changes, these very important demographic changes. And even countries where there hasn't been this market shift, for example, in Egypt, where in 1965 it was 40%, I think, beg your pardon, it was 41% of the population lived in the countryside, lived in cities. Now it's just over 50%. So there hasn't been this massive shift, if you like. But actually, Egypt is a place where there is the megacity, probably one of the three most important cities, apart from Tehran, well, including Tehran and Istanbul, where there is over 11 million of the population. And again, inside the countryside, huge changes, the huge changes that have taken place. There's also been a fundamental change with the nature of the Arab bourgeoisie itself. I always tell the story of the founder of Saudi Arabia when the Americans discovered oil and they wanted to extract the oil from Saudi Arabia. They offered him $30,000 in gold. This was the price, if you like, in 1933 for them to extract this for them to extract this oil. They formed a company called Aramco, the American Arab Oil Corporation, which was owned by the US and US companies that extracted the super profits out of Saudi oil. Aramco is now known as Saudi Aramco. It was bought up by the Saudi regime and is probably one of the biggest and most important oil producing firms in the world. And you just look really at the massive wealth accumulated by the Arab bourgeoisie. It gives you an idea of where they are. For example, so the richest, I'll just look this up today, according to 2000, so pre-revolutionary figures, the richest 50 Arab families, their combined wealth, which is wealth that we actually can look at, not the hidden wealth, is 160 billion. So 50 richest Arab families have between them 160 billion pounds, up from 120 a few years ago. So it gives you an idea. So excluding the wealth of the oil princes, the sheikhs, and so on, it gives you an idea. And also, just to put it in proportion, the national debt of Lebanon, the crippling national debt of Lebanon, is 30 billion. It's actually how much is owned by one man, Prince Tawil. He personally owns something like 50 billion. So you have, if you like, this huge disparity between the wealth and the poverty inside the Arab world. So what is the nature now? So we can look at the period before, we can look at there were tribal societies or agricultural societies. What was the nature actually of Arab society these days? The society in the Middle East is overwhelmingly urban, and the vast majority of people are involved in some kind of work, whether sweeping floors or driving trains or driving buses or serving at McDonald's or working in textile mills or working in the ports. Actually, the vast majority of these people are involved in some kind of capitalism, if you like, as part of the capitalist system. So with the sort of deep social changes that are taking place, especially over the last decade or so, the regimes that were above them come from a different era. So even the Saudi regime, or even the republics, Syria, or Egypt, or Libya, or any of these, the regimes and the system of rule goes back way behind, to the 60s and the 50s and the 30s, and yet the societies themselves have changed so dramatically that actually these regimes then became a block to any further social change. So with the outbreak of revolutions, and this period of the outbreak of revolutions, were not themselves a question of, it wasn't posed like, should we have reforms or should we have a revolution? Because even to make the most minor reform actually meant taking on the state. So the question of revolution became a necessity inside the Arab world rather than simply one of an option. It became, if you like, just even to organize yourselves, to have a small strike meant taking on the full might of the state. And it is, if you like, this process of revolution with the masses beginning to come through, I think we have to then say, okay, where does the working class, the modern working class in the Arab world, fit into the revolutionary process? I think it's important that try and explain a little bit what we mean by the centrality of the working class. Marx, in 1844, wrote quite an interesting pamphlet. It was called Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. And people probably know it from the quote, religion is the opium of the people, and so on. But this is an extraordinarily interesting pamphlet because he wrote it just on the eve of the 1848 revolutions, the bourgeois revolutions. And he drew out three distinct elements that he thought that he pointed to revolution. The first one was, and just to quote him, is that radical revolution and universal human emancipation is not a utopian dream. What is a utopian dream is the partial or merely political revolution that leaves the pillars of the house standing. That is, that it's not enough, it's not possible, if you like, it's more utopian to think you can simply make a political revolution, you can simply have political change and leave the rest of the structures of the state and so on in place. Actually, to do one, you have to go all the way through and destroy the structures of the state. Okay, fair enough. The second point he makes is that the demand of the right of a particular class becomes the demand and claims of society itself, of society which this class is the social head and the social heart. That is, one class will emerge in this revolutionary process which will take upon itself the task of the general liberation. And I think the term to become its social head and its social heart, I think, is really important for understanding development of the role of the working class. And finally, he says this. He says, a particular social sphere must stand for the notorious crimes of society as a whole, so that emancipation from this sphere appears as a general emancipation. For the class to be par excellence, the class of emancipation, another must conversely be the class of oppression. That is, again, that if we look at Egypt, the most obvious example, that all the ills and all the pains inside society will focus on Mubarak's regime. And so there is, if you like, that process of revolution where everything is pointed at one particular class or one particular regime. And inversely as well, is that those who then go in a revolution, an insurrection against this, also take with them and embody in them this sense of change. And I think which class then we say can do this? Which class can become the social heart and the social head? And how does a class become the social heart and the social head of a revolution? I think it's important that we sort of just mention sort of the basics of the working class, because some people sort of mistake this and simply think the reason why we say the working class is the major agent of change has to do that it's more oppressed or it's poorer. Actually, it's not necessarily the case. The peasantry is usually much more oppressed. There's sections of society, the urban poor and so on, a much worse situation than the working class. The importance of the working class side of capitalism is actually this is where profit comes from. It is from the labour of the working class that profit comes from, that then becomes capital, and then the whole of the system runs. So it is, if you like, its centre inside the production process that actually means that the working class has a particular powerful position in capitalism. Capitalism itself, in its more modern form, really has this at its most extreme, and we can see this, with the divisions of wealth and poverty inside of the Middle East. The incredible amount of capital, incredible amount of wealth created by the Arab working class, and how it's concentrated inside of a few hands. Marx said, and his contention was that when the working class emancipated itself, when the working class broke this relation of exploitation and broke and broke its chains, if you like, inside the system, then we see the collapse of capitalism. And with the collapse of capitalism, then you can move into a new era. However, there is a problem with this, which is the working class is not the majority class. It is large, especially in places like Egypt and so on. It is a huge component. But there are other classes as well inside of that we would generally call amongst the masses. There is huge sections, huge numbers of the urban poor, a lot of whom might do some day labouring or might buy a few goods in order to peddle. There is that class. There's a class who are, if you like, sort of the petty bourgeoisie, small shopkeepers, people who buy and sell on a small level. There's the peasantry. There are sections of the middle class, like doctors and so on. So there are these other classes also that exist inside society. So how is it then the working class can lead these other classes? How can it, if you like, come to embody the interests of these other classes in the interests of the working class, and in so doing lead these other classes in a process of social change? In other words, how can the working class become both the social head and the social heart of a wider movement? I think what we're seeing inside this revolutionary period inside the Middle East is this class more and more beginning to form. We're beginning to see it develop in this sense of the social heart and the social head. And I think it's important that we have also an understanding of the nature of the revolutions, and then I'll try and explain how I see the working class fitting inside of it. I think there's two elements to these revolutions that are important. The first is the mass insurrectionary demonstrations that we saw. That is the masses, not necessarily from the working class. They could be working class, they could be urban poor, they could be young students and so on, coming into the streets and having an insurrection that in essence means a mass demonstration followed by the burning of a police station or the overrunning of a police barracks or winning over soldiers, all these elements. That element of physically confronting forces of repression, the forces of the apparatus of the state, and defeating them. This is what we saw inside of, in a real way, inside of Egypt. Also with that, though, is that other part of it, which is the working class itself then entering into the struggle, not as participants in mass demonstrations, but as a class in itself. The development of the strike movement inside of Egypt into the revolution was the thing, I think, that really propelled it forward. You had the general strike inside of Suez, followed by the strikes inside of the other areas, in Mahal al-Kubra, and so on. And that moment in where Mubarak called for the return to work Monday, and instead of everyone returning to work, everyone walked into work and then probably walked back out and strike. And that strike wave going into the military factories, I think, was probably the tipping edge for the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces to then give Mubarak the coup de grace, if you like, to get rid of him. I think this is important that we understand both these elements, because we can see in other parts of the Middle East, in the other revolutions, where they're not there. So we can look at Yemen, where they have huge demonstrations, absolutely monster demonstrations of 1 million. Almost every day you see these demonstrations after demonstrations after demonstrations, yet Ali Saleh is still in place. What you don't see is the same kind of strike wave that we had inside of Egypt. And the same with Syria. Again, extraordinarily brave. Months of these attempted insurrectionary demonstrations, general strikes, citywide general strikes inside of Homs, inside of Hama, and Daraa, and all these places, very, very extremely brave, losing people dying, I think 40 or 50 a day at some points, yet this not moving into the huge factories surrounding Hama, or the huge factories surrounding Homs, or even the factories inside of Aleppo and the key kind of industrial areas. So if you like, you have the mass revolutionary demonstrations, confrontation of the army, the police, and so on, but without the strike wave behind it, actually means that it's been unable to break through. In a similar way, we have the opposite problem inside of Kuwait. If you look at Kuwait, you'll see over the last 2 or 3 weeks, that's the last month, if you like, a huge wave of strikes, starting with the oil workers, followed by the port workers, the teachers, the custom workers, and so on. Fantastic, absolutely amazing strikes, really significant and victorious strikes, yet we don't have that other element, which are the mass insurrectionary demonstrations. There are no mass demonstrations inside of Kuwait. No one is burning down police stations. And so if you see how we have, if you like, this huge unevenness. And why this unevenness is important is when we look at the case of Libya, where you had the mass insurrectionary demonstrations, the hints of a general strike, but very quickly it turning into a huge armed confrontation, an uprising, in which really the question of strikes didn't feature at all. What's interesting about Libya is what's happened since. In the last week, the oil workers have finally come out on strike in the same process of what's taking place in Egypt. They went out on strike to remove the old managers, the Gaddafi-era directors, and so on. And why this is important is because NATO and the Transition National Council want them to remain in their place. And so, if you like, you begin to see the beginning, again, the reawakening of the revolutionary process inside of Libya. So we have, if you like, then this extraordinarily uneven situation from the first outbreakings of the revolutions of the Arab Spring in January till now. Really, the last real success we can talk about was the fall of Hosni Mubarak. All the rest have been extraordinarily difficult. It involved the appearance of imperialism, huge amounts of bloodshed, and so on. And so when we look at it in those circumstances, then we look back. Let's look back into the revolutionary process itself, and I'm going to concentrate again on Egypt. And this is, I think, why it's important is because we can then see this process, how the process of the working class then beginning to find its way towards being the social heart and the social head to deepen the revolution, if you like, to deepen the revolution. What took place after the fall of Mubarak? What took place after the fall of Mubarak, I think, was really interesting, because I think you speak to a lot of people, a lot of Egyptians I've come across as well, who are very, very depressed about what's taking place in Egypt, because they look at what's happened in Tahrir since the 25th of January, the appearance of the Salafis, the way that the military seems to be embedding its power rather than simply being part of a transition, and of course the terrible massacre of the Coptic Christians that took place 2 or 3 weeks ago outside Maspero. And you begin to and the way in which the sort of feature of the mass demonstrations of the 25th of January revolution now seem to have disappeared completely. And you can look at that and actually get quite depressed. But alternatively, you can then look at how the revolution has developed inside the Egyptian working class, and you begin to see quite amazing transformations. I mean, Anne will probably correct me on this, but I was looking at some figures, actually figures Anne posted up, so I'll blame her for it, of the number of strikes that have taken place in Egypt. And it was really interesting. In January, there were 42 strikes in Egypt. By February, there were 450, 460 odd strikes. It's a bit of a spike. So even if these figures are an underestimation, it gives you an idea of how huge the strike wave was, and it's continued since. And it's the nature of the strikes that I think are very interesting, because people talk about taking the Tahrir back into the workplace, into the office, into the school, and so on. What does this actually mean? This means that that revolution that took place on a large scale is now reproducing itself on a small scale inside of Egyptian factories and offices. And so you get the situation where people coming back from the revolution, then going on strike, demanding a set of economic and political demands. And the economic demands are things like 300% wage increase, please make good on the promises you made back in 1982. I think was one of the demands that actually people want an immediate economic, if you like, to take the immediate economic struggle forward. Included in these was then the political demands to get rid of the boss, to have an elected factory. I think in one of the major hospitals they threw out the director, formed a huge union, and then elected a new director. And again, you can see the struggle going into universities, the American University of Cairo, or Shams University in Alexandria, which they're calling the general strikes, and how these strikes are on the whole successful, even though to a certain extent that they're winning promises, and how they're deepening, and how in this process they are pulling in hundreds of thousands, probably not millions, of people directly into class struggle. And it is to understand this process that I think is really important. Every member of the SWP, of course, has to quote Rosa Luxemburg, and I will do the same. And she Rosa Luxemburg was a German revolutionary describing the mass strikes inside of Russia in 1905. But actually, I think she wrote it about Egypt. She was just a century early. And she describes this process of the political and the economic coming together. And she says this: in every great political mass action, after it has attained its political high point, it breaks up into a mass of economic strikes. And between the two, there is an almost complete reciprocal action. That is one, well, economic demands, economic strikes feeding the political demands and coming back. The importance of this, I think, is not simply then just to compartmentalize what is an economic strike and what is a political strike, but actually to try and look at them together and understand how they can then generate an even higher level of politics. So you'd have a strike, for example, in a factory in which they wanted, for example, a 200 or 300% wage increase. This is specific for the factory. It can include other things, bonuses and so on, in which if you win this demand inside of the factory, not inside of the wider working class. So you can say this is a specifically economic demand. Then you have the political demands that come out of it. So that the political demand could be the sacking of your boss, the getting rid of a local governor, the getting rid of a local police chief, and so on, actually taking, if you like, generalizing the economic demands into political demands themselves. And then there is, I think, an even higher level than this, which is that the centers, the heart of the growing working class movement then looks at itself as a class and begins to consider the other weaker sections of the class and to make demands on their behalf. And we saw this process, I think, in that great dress rehearsal, the strikes of 2006 through to 2008, especially in Mahalla al-Kubra. I think it's very interesting that we look at that, then we can see the pattern reappearing again. The original demands of the Mahalla strikes were, again, local economic. They then went into confrontation with the state. A certain amount of people, a certain amount of the activists were arrested. It then became political demand for their release and so on. You can see this. When it came back again, what was really interesting was that there was an attempt to have a strike, or a general strike, which his demand was a national minimum wage. That is, taking, if you like, winning the demands for the class generally, to look beyond your factory and beyond the immediate things of the factory, and to, if you like, take on the whole of the oppressed, the whole of the poor, and to say everyone deserves a better life and so on. This is, if you like, the class, the Egyptian working class in this case, beginning to develop, if you like, its social heart. That is, it looks beyond its own immediate interests and then begins to look at the wider interests of the class as a whole, and the other classes, the urban poor and so on. So from this, it can be about housing for the poor, the question of the lands for the peasants, and so on. All this actually means it begins to develop its social heart in a real kind of way. But that in itself is not enough. You also need it to develop, if you like, its social head. What Marx calls the social head. And I think this is quite important, because here the working class, or the most advanced sections of the working class, have to tackle the immediately difficult questions, extremely difficult questions that don't necessarily matter too much in the factory or in the field. This would be, for example, the question of women, the status of women's society inside Egypt. I think this has taken on the sharpest question, on the question of the Coptic Christians, the sectarianism and the repression of the Coptic Christians. So you can have, if you like, a very good position on the question of economic demands inside your factory, very good trade unionism. You can then have a wider question of the state of the working class, political trade unionism and so on. But then what's your position on the repression of the Copts? This then becomes, if you like, the point at which the working class has to, if you like, go beyond its immediate interests and start thinking in a much bigger and much wider, in a much wider way. Of course, this is extraordinarily difficult, because you then have to take on questions that are not necessarily come from your own experience, but one that has to generalize constantly. That has to constantly generalize. 5 minutes to go. Okay. And the importance of this is, of course, the question of the oppression, the suppression of the Copts inside of Egypt is the rallying call for the counter-revolution. This is the thing in which it has focused on, in which it is drawing a whole series of forces behind it. Including Salafis, the old thugs, Mubarak's people, sections of the army, and so on, actually finding this point at which they can try and break the unity of the revolution itself. So it's very important then for the working class, if you like, to develop in order to understand that this is a general struggle for the working class. So you begin to see it. I mean, Anne could probably tell us more about it, and how much and what position many of the independent trade unions took on the question of the COPs, and how it's developed, what kind of arguments that they had through it. The idea then that the working class develops itself inside a revolution to take the leadership of the other oppressed classes to, if you like, become the social heart of the revolution, but also then to see itself in its historic role. And this is the point I don't think we've quite reached inside. Well, we haven't actually reached inside of the Arab Revolution, where then it grows over. It's not simply the partial revolution that keeps the pillars of the house and state, that actually then goes beyond what we call permanent revolution. That is, that it carries its historical task, to use Marxist terminology, to go beyond the immediate political revolution, to actually go towards a socialist revolution, the second revolution, I think they call it. What we're seeing now inside of the Arab revolutions is all of these things developing. They're all developing unevenly, and they're all developing in different places, at different speeds at different places, and some places still haven't been able to get the first breakthrough. But it is precisely, if you like, this development, specifically inside of Egypt, of a class that is finding, it's becoming a class for itself, a class that is finding and developing its own strength, both locally but also politically on a wider way, that actually throws up the possibility of a permanent revolution in a way we haven't seen for at least 50 years. And I think under conditions that are much better now than they were in the 1940s and the 1950s. I'll leave it back to you.